Good morning, all the English-speaking world. My name is Ecrlinf-Linnik. I am Russian philologist and translator of the English and French literature, and also I am learning Spanish language now. The complete list of my published translations you can find in the description of my channel on platform YouTube, on platform RootTube, and on platform ВКонтакте. This list will be updated. Now, I am preparing to be a school teacher, an English teacher at some Russian school. And in this video, I will present you a rehearsal of some my lesson. The first part of this video is my self-presentation to my pupils, to my students. I want to underline that I will not teach English language for some little children. I will teach some teenagers. And the first part of this video is my self-presentation. In the first part of this video, I show you how I will introduce myself for my students, for my pupils. And the second part of this video is my discussion, my speech about the meaning of the Ukrainian war. I want to underline that I don't want to transform all my lessons into some political informations. I will not discuss about politics. I will not spend very much times for the discussion about politics. Of course, no. I will principally discuss about literature, and I will propose to my students, to my pupils, to read classical English texts. For example, the text of such authors, the texts of such writers as Jack London and Ernest Hemingway. Their language is not very difficult. Their language is relatively simple. I will propose to my students, I will propose to my pupils to read the novels of these great writers. But sometimes I will discuss with them about politics. And now this is rehearsal. This is rehearsal of my discussion about politics. My discussion about my speech about the Ukrainian war, actual Ukrainian war. I want to underline that in my real lessons, it will not be my monologue. It will not be my speech for the silent classroom, my speech for the group of silent students, for the group of silent pupils. Of course not. In my real lessons, it will be my communication with my students, with my pupils. Now I am reading. Now I am reading the scientific books about the teaching of English language, about how we must teach English language. At the end of previous video, I presented you these books. I bought them, I purchased them in some bookshop directly, officially connected with the publishing houses, Oxford University Press, with the publishing house, Cambridge University Press. Now I am reading these special books, these scientific books about teaching of English language. So I know that I must communicate with my students, with my pupils. So my lessons will not be my monologues, my speeches for the silent classroom, my speech for the group of silent students. Of course not. Of course no. For example, I will pronounce some phrase, and immediately after that, I will propose to some pupil, I will propose to some student to go to the board and to write this phrase on the board. And immediately after that, I will propose to some another student, to some another pupil, to translate this phrase into Russian language. So it will be my communication with my students, with my pupils. I repeat that I will not teach little children. I will teach teenagers, the groups of teenagers. So, but now in this video, it will be my speech. It will be my monologue. So, firstly, I will present myself. I will introduce myself to my students, to my pupils. So how I will introduce myself, how I will present myself to my students, to my pupils. So, my dear students, my dear pupils, my name is Ecrlinf-Linnik, and I am not professional English teacher. I am professional translator of the English and French literature. But my problem is that Russian publishers, Russian editors don't want to publish the books interesting, to publish Russian translations of the books interesting for me. Instead of this, they propose for me to translate some books not interesting for me. And that's why I decided to completely change my tactic and strategy, to completely change my behavior, my professional behavior. I decided to go to school, to work at school as an English teacher. And every evening, every second half of every day, I will read classical English, French, and Spanish literature, and I will translate into Russian language that classical English, French, and Spanish texts which not yet translated into Russian. There are many classical texts in English classical literature, in the French classical literature, in the Spanish classical literature. There are many very interesting texts not yet translated into Russian. The novels, the novellas, the short stories, the plays of theater, many such texts, classical texts. I will not translate into Russian some forgotten texts. No, I will translate only classical texts which are acknowledged as classical texts, which are published now by the modern publishing houses, which are studied now in all the universities and so on. So there are many such texts in classical English literature, in classical Spanish literature, in classical French literature. I will translate them into Russian language, and I will publish my translations in the Russian literary magazines. So during the next 3 years, the first half of every day, I will earn my money by teaching English language at some Russian school, and every second half of every day, of each day, I will earn my glory, I will earn my fame, I will earn my professional reputation as a translator of the classical English, French, and Spanish literature. This is my plan for the next 3 years. The next 3 years, I will work at some Russian school as English teacher, and my free time I will dedicate for the translations of the classical English, French, and Spanish texts not yet translated into Russian, and I will publish my translations in Russian literary magazines. So this is my plan, and this is my plan, and this is my presentation for my pupils, for my students. And now, This is my discussion about politics. Sometimes I will discuss with my pupils, with my students, about politics, about policy, about international relationships. Sometimes, because I repeat that, I will teach teenagers. I will not teach some little children. I will teach some teenagers, the groups of some teenagers, and many of them are interested by politics, and maybe such discussion will be interesting for them. So how I will express my own opinion about this situation, about the situation in Ukraine, about this war. My opinion is that this war is not the war between Russia and Ukraine. This is the war between Russia and the West, Russian civilization and the Western civilization. And the responsible of this conflict, the principal responsible is the Western civilization, especially Anglo-Saxon civilization. This is my opinion. Please look to Wikipedia, read Wikipedia article about the history of Ukraine of the 21st century. It's evident, it's obvious that Western civilization, especially Anglo-Saxon civilization, organized two revolutions in Ukraine. The first revolution in 2000, in the year 2003, in the 2003 year, the relatively peaceful revolution. This first Ukrainian revolution was relatively peaceful, and another, the second revolution, bloody revolution, in the year 2014, in the year 2014. This second revolution was the bloody, very tragic revolution with many victims. And as a result of this revolution, the Western civilization, especially Anglo-Saxon, installed in Ukraine some extremely nationalist regime with the elements of neo-Nazism, some extremely nationalist regime, the regime of nationalist fanatics. But the population of South Ukraine, the population of Eastern Ukraine, rejected this new revolutionary power, rejected this new power of the nationalist fanatics. And after that, this group of nationalist fanatics who came to power in Kiev in the year 2014, in the year 2014, this group of nationalist fanatics started mass repressions, mass persecutions in South Ukraine, and started the war against Eastern Ukraine. This is the principal reason of this. But this is the cause of this war. But the most interesting question, the most important question: why Western civilization installed in Ukraine this extremely nationalist regime based on the ideology of the hate towards Russia? Why they did this? My opinion, it's because now all the Western civilization, especially Anglo-Saxon civilization, is under the great influence of the liberal fanatics, of the liberal fundamentalists, and they hate Russia. They hate Russia. They hate modern Russia. They hate the Russia of the President Putin, because in modern Russia, the President Putin created some system, some effective system, some successful system, and some relatively liberal system, but the system different from the Western system. And Western liberal fanatics, they cannot tolerate some state, some successful state, some rich state, some effective state, which lives according to some systems, according to some order different from the Western liberal order, because this is the psychology of all the fanatics. This is the psychology of all the fundamentalists. They, in some depth of their souls, all the fanatics, all the fundamentalists doubt about the truth of their faith, about the truth of their believings. In some depth of their souls, all the fanatics, all the fundamentalists suspect that their faith is not true, that their faith, their belief is not true, that their believing is not true, and that's why they want to convert all the humankind into their faith, into their believing, into their belief. That's why, because of their own doubt, because of their own suspicion that their believing that their faith is not true. That's why they want to convert all the humankind into their believing, into their faith, because they could not live quietly while somewhere in the universe, somewhere in the earth, somewhere in the world, there are some people with another opinions, with another believings, with another faith, some people with another ideology. This is the psychology of all the fanatics, of all the fundamentalists, including liberal fanatics and liberal fundamentalists. And that's why the modern Western liberal fanatics hate Russia, because hate Putin's Russia, hate the Russia of the President Putin, because now in Russia, Mr. Putin created some system, some effective system, some successful, and some relatively liberal system, and some relatively humanistic system, which is different from the Western liberal system. That's why the Western politicians hate Russia, and that's why they provoked this war in Ukraine. Because Russia always was, my opinion, that Russia always was Russian system, Russian order, always was possibly less liberal. Russian civilization always was possibly less liberal than Western civilization, but more humanistic civilization that Western, for example, the Prince Vladimir, who came to Kiev at the 10th century, in early medieval Europe, Prince Vladimir, who came to Kiev from Novgorod, because at that time Novgorod was the more powerful center of Russia than Kiev, and Novgorod dictated to Kiev which prince would rule over the Russia. So Prince Vladimir, who came to Kiev from Novgorod, when he baptized Russia, when he declared the Christianity as official religion of Russia, immediately after that, immediately after baptism, immediately after the declaration of Christianity as official religion of Russia, immediately after that, Prince Vladimir abolished the death penalty in Russia, in early medieval Russia, in the Russia of 10th century. Prince abolished temporarily, yes, it was temporary abolishment. It's unclear how long this abolishment existed. It's unclear how long this abolishment was valuable. Possibly during not very long time. Possibly during not very long time, this abolishment was valuable. But the fact is that Prince Vladimir understood the, the central idea, the central humanistic idea of Christianity, the idea of absolute value of every human life, absolute value of every human being. This is the first fact. This is the first fact which proves that Russia always was more humanistic civilization, possibly less liberal civilization, but more humanistic civilization than the Western civilization. The second fact, very interesting fact, Russia of 18th century, the second abolishment of the second abolishment of the death penalty in Russia. In Russia of 18th century, the Empress Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter the Great, abolished death penalty during all her ruling, during all the time when she ruled over Russia. There was no death penalty in Russia because when she came to power, she promised to the God to abolish death penalty, and she fulfilled her promise. During all her ruling, there was no death penalty in Russia. She ruled over Russia during more than 20 years. And after that, during the ruling of the Empress Catherine the Great, the death penalty in Russia was some exceptional event, was some extraordinary event, was some very seldom event. And at the same time, in England, the death penalty was so frequent event that the hanged bodies, the gibbets, the gallows, were the necessary elements of all the English landscapes at that time, as well as now the wind power stations, the wind electricity stations. Imagine the rows of the lines, the collections of gibbets, of gallows, of the hanged bodies, instead of modern wind electricity stations. And you will see the typical English landscape of the 18th century. And at the same, so Russia of 18th century was far more humanistic country, far more humanistic state than England. Another difference between Russia and England, Russian Empire and British Empire. When Russia annexed some territory, when some territory became the part of Russian Empire, some new territory became the part of Russia, such as Siberia, such as Middle Asia, such as Crimea, which was the part of Ottoman Empire before the first Russian annexion, before it was annexed by Russia at the first time at the 18th century. So when some territory became, some new territory became the part of Russian Empire, the new Russian powers abolished the slavery in these territories. It's evident, this is historical fact. In Russian Empire, there was no slavery. Yes, sometimes the relationships between Russian landlords and between Russian countrymen, simple countrymen, between Russian agriculture workers, sometimes these relationships were very similar to the slavery, but it was not slavery, it was feudality. In England and in North America, sometimes the relationships between workers on the factory and the proprietors of this, the capital between the workers, relationship between the workers and the capitalists are also very similar to the slavery, but it was not slavery. So in Russian Empire, there was no slavery. When Russia annexed some new territories, the new Russian powers immediately abolished the slavery in these territories. For example, Middle Asia, for example, Siberia, for example, Crimea. This is the second difference between Russian Empire and British Empire, and between Russian civilization and the Western civilization. what did the British Empire and French colonial empire with slavery in their colonies. You know very well. You know very well the origin of such ethnical groups and as African American people. So this is the difference between Russian civilization and the Western civilization. Russian civilization was always possibly not so liberal then, not so democratic than the Western civilization, but at the same time, Russia always was a more humanistic civilization. More humanistic, possibly not very liberal, possibly not very democratic. Russia always was not so democratic, not so liberal state than Western European states. For example, England. For example, at the 18th century, in England was a developed democracy. In England was a parliament, several political parties, free elections, independent judgment system, and so on. In Russia, at the 18th century, there was absolute monarchy and dictatorship of noblemen. By the way, one of father's founders of communism, Friedrich Engels, called Alexander Suvorov the great Russian military chief. And Engels called him the naked sword of the dictatorship of noblemen, the naked sword of the dictatorship of aristocracy. So in Russia of 18th century, there was dictatorship of noblemen, there was dictatorship of aristocracy without any hint to democracy. And also England of 18th century was not only a more democratic state, but also far more liberal state. England of 18th century was not only far more democratic state, but also far more liberal state than Russia. In England, for example, in England of 18th century, you could openly express your non-religious opinions or even your anti-religious opinions. And in Russia of that time, in Russia of 18th century, you could not openly express your non-religious opinions. Although in Russia of that time, there were some non-believers among aristocracy, among noblemen. Of course, there were some non-believers, but they could not openly express their opinions. So England of 18th century was far more democratic state and far more liberal state than Russia. But at the same time, in England of 18th century, the death penalties, the capital punishments were very frequent events, were common events. The death penalties, the capital punishments were the most frequent form of punishment. And in Russia of 18th century, the death penalty was some exceptional event, was some extraordinary event. And during the ruling of the Empress Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter the Great, during her ruling, the death penalty was completely abolished. And she ruled over Russia during more than 20 years. This is the historical fact. And another fact is that in Russian Empire, there was no slavery. So there are several historical facts which prove that Russian civilization always was less liberal but more humanistic civilization than the Western civilization. And that's why Western civilization always hated Russia, because Russia is Western politicians, know that Russia is a part of European civilization. Russia is a part of Christian civilization, but at the same time, Russia is developing some another system, some another lifestyle, some another style of life, some another style of politics, some another social order, different from the Western order, different from the Western system. And for the modern liberal fanatics, for the modern liberal fundamentalists, this is unacceptable. This is some nonsense for them. This is contradiction to all their philosophy, to all their ideology. This is my opinion. Why? And I think that in order to prevent a new world war, the Western politicians must diminish their liberal fundamentalism, must diminish their liberal fanaticism. Possibly, it will be some peace talks. Possibly, it will be some talks about peace between Russian civilization and Western civilization. Possibly, Mr. Putin must reject his idea that Ukrainian nation is a part of Russian nation. Possibly, Mr. Putin must recognize that Ukrainian nation is a different nation, as well as Portuguese nation is different from Spanish nation, as well as Brazilian nation is different from Argentinian nation. They are very similar nations with very similar languages, Portuguese and Spanish, but with one religion. But at the same time, they are different nations, as well as Russians and Ukrainians. Possibly we must recognize this, that Ukrainian nation is different. Ukrainian nation is not a part of Russia, but Ukrainian state must recognize that the population of South Ukraine and the population of Eastern Ukraine are not parts of Ukrainian nation. There are other parts of Russian nation. The population of Eastern Ukraine is a part of Russian, and the population of South Ukraine is a part of Russian nation. They must recognize this. And Western, especially Western civilization, especially Anglo-Saxon civilization, especially Anglo-Saxon politics, Anglo-Saxon politicians must recognize that the Russian-speaking population of modern Ukraine, especially Eastern Ukraine and South Ukraine, this is not the part of Ukrainian nation. This is the part of Russian nation. And I hope that we can prevent a new world war. I hope we can prevent some nuclear war, especially if we diminish our fanaticism. All the men, all the people must diminish their fanaticism, must diminish their fundamentalism in order to prevent a new world war. This is the end of my speech. Thank you for your attention. This is the rehearsal. This is the rehearsal of my future English lesson. I repeat that in my real lesson, it will not be my speech before the silent classroom, before the group of silent students, before the group of silent pupils. Of course not. It will be my communication, my discussion with them. I will express my opinion, and they answer to me. They will express their own opinions, and also I will when I will pronounce some phrase, or when some pupil, some student will pronounce some phrase, I will immediately propose to him to go to the board and to write this phrase on the board, and I will immediately propose to some another student to translate this phrase into Russian language. So this is a rehearsal of my possible future English lesson. Thank you for your attention.